Yeah, let me go click live and then here we go.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fourth and final lecture of the Fall 2021 lecture series, titled Perspectives on Practice. My name is Fernando Arana, moderating with Matthew Newsom and Ramses Allende. If everyone, as they join, can mute their mics, that would be very, very appreciated. And nothing, just now I would like to pass it to Matthew Newsom so we can introduce our speaker today, Elisa Silva. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. So Elisa is the director and founder of Enlace Arquitectura, established in 2007, a multidisciplinary professional practice in architecture, urban design, and landscape architecture, and also the Enlace Foundation, established in 2017, an NGO that promotes cultural and educational programs of social inclusion and processes of participatory design. Enlace's work has been recognized and awarded at the 11th and 7th Ibero-American Biennale of Architecture and Urbanism, the 20th Architecture Biennale in Chile, and is part of the 17th International Architecture Exhibition at the Biennale di Venezia 2021 and the Chicago Architecture Biennale, the Available City 2021. Elisa has received the Rome Prize for the American Academy 2005, the Wheelwright Fellowship from Harvard University in 2011, Graham Foundation Grant 2017 and 2021, and the Lucas Artist Fellowship in 2019. She is the author of several publications, including Pure Space, Expanding the Public Sphere Through Public Space Transformations in Latin American Informal Settlements, and CABA, which is the Cartography of the Caracas Barrios in 2015. Elisa has a Master of Architecture from Harvard GSD. She has taught at Princeton University, University of Toronto, Harvard GSD, and Simon Bolivar University. She is an associate professor at FIU with a joint appointment at the School of Architecture and the Wolstonian Public Humanities Lab. And now I'll pass it on to Elisa to start her presentation.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Fernando, and thank you, Ramses, for moderating this session. I'm going to start to share my screen. Let me know when it's on view. And,
we see it.
Okay. This, I hope, will be somewhat of a conversation. I'll be keeping watch if anybody feels like interrupting or asking questions along the way. I've titled it Narratives of the Built Environment because I feel that part of what we do in design and architecture can be not only a passive sort of observing the narratives that already exist out there, but even, you know, shaping them, questioning them, rewriting them. And so our practice has more, let's say, conventional, although they're not so terribly conventional projects. The Sabana Grande Boulevard, which received an award from the BIAO, the Biennial of Urbanism and Architecture in Iberoamerica, which is Spain, Portugal, and all of Latin America. And the San Juan Maria Vianney Church, which also received a similar award years later. And today I'm not going to talk about these projects except to offer that they were significant, and I'm also very grateful for all the lessons learned and sort of the difference that I feel our practice has, or a divergence it's taken since then. Caracas is the place where we mostly operate, and it has its own narrative, of course. It's very often depicted this way, as a view from the southern part of the city across the valley of the kind of city itself, and along the other side of the mountain, you see, on the other side of the valley, you see a very, very lush mountain, which is the Avila Mountain. It's a view from a distance. It's a view that I think has allowed, I mean, what a resource to have in a city, but it's also allowed for a kind of complacency about what is going on the ground, and some of these more complex aspects, which is, this is also Caracas. This is a view from the Cota 905. And how does this work its way into the narrative, right? Or how does the river that flows through Caracas, the river Rio Guaire, how does it have a place in the narrative of the city? It's the no place, the non-place, the kind of repository of literally all the excrements of the city, and has even been topped off by this highway built in the 50s. So I'm actually going to start with a very recent project. I'm going to tell 3 stories is basically what I'm hoping to do with you guys, and about this river and its place as part of the narrative of a city that's always looking at the mountain, but not really at its own navel very much. And it's had the participation of many. It's a project we're doing together with Ciudad Laboratorio and a group of ever increasing participants and artists as well. What is this narrative? So when you look up Rio Guaire in the Google, you'll find this myriad kind of cacophony of interpretations. And so it's a place where recently, because of water scarcity, people are going down to collect water, even though it is contaminated by all the kind of sewage water that is collected in the city. It's also a place where, because of all of that kind of collection and even waste, other kinds of waste, kids, some not so young, are called the miners of the Rio Guaire, and they will extract things from the bottom that they can then either use or sell. It's also known for its terrible inundations, floating bodies of dead people, and recently also with in the 2017 demonstrations, it was a way for students who were protesting to shelter themselves from the government, who was basically chasing them. And these are all the narratives. I mean, there are many more that kind of plague this poor river. So we started last year a project called Rio Guaire. It has a web page that I invite you to visit, and the beginnings of unpacking what this narrative has left us, what it's done to the city, and how to interrogate it further. We often start projects, Ciudad Laboratorio and ourselves, we're now in, this is our second or third project together, with a manifesto that's written by Chio Carvajal. And it's in Spanish, so I'll just paraphrase a few of its components, but it's basically asking, we need to make it visible. We need to not, hide it, or hide it with Christmas lights, which is often a practice. But this is a large invitation to transform it from the citizens, from schools, from artists, from all sorts of professionals, an invitation to think of it as a utopia that's in process, and that is not about crazy demagogical promises, but about a real and felt future. And it just needs kind of an engagement and an agenda. So this webpage has begun to collect essays from all sorts of angles and interpretations, both historical, from artists, through literature, through events that have been recorded in newspapers over the years. The view given by artists is one that we're keen to kind of celebrate. For example, Amanda Granado with this piece that's from the early 2000s, just imagining this sewage channel basically as a place for leisure. Or Gerardo Chavarse recently wrote this article on Conrado Pitari, who's a Venezuelan artist, documenting this activity that's so connected now with the imaginary of the river, of kids extracting things from the bottom. But if you go back in time, obviously this river was a bucolic piece of the landscape, and it's often been rendered by different artists. This is a painting by Manuel Cabré of the early 20th century. And you can find that in the past, all the way up until the early 20th century, I would say, the Rio Guaire is seen in a very positive light. It is eventually kind of, conquered as the city expands to the south with its first bridges, like the Iron Bridge that we see here from 1895. And its edges were often, populated by people using it to clean clothes. And the newspaper then, El Cojo Ilustrado, which Carlos Alfredo Marin, part of this team, has been looking through archives and collecting articles from the past, has shown us that, you would find something like the poetic river that ties the waste of the southern part of Caracas with silver, offers beautiful and varied perspectives of the dilated extension it travels. And another one would say, the view that appears in this edition is one of the most beautiful perspectives of the Guaire, south of the city. This is towards the end as it comes through the city in El Encantado. People were just, touring a Sunday walk. Another bridge, the Puente de Olores, that goes over the Avenida Paraíso, just at the end of the 19th century. And then leaping forward, after terrible inundations that happened in the 40s, it gets channeled. It gets controlled. It gets it becomes the operation of engineering. And here we can see some images of the process of it being channeled into concrete that started from the southwestern edge and traveling, southeastern edge and traveling westward. You can see it right here as it's sort of gotten to its edge. And it's coupled always with this fast, rapid transit system, which grows over time with second stories, et cetera. And the river becomes something that is shunned, that is a piece of engineering. It's distant. It no longer has that relationship with the city in any kind of dimension. It's actually even used to as a synonym for something undesirable. And this narrative is something that we're trying to kind of understand better. It starts, in the colonial times as something very pure and amenable and bucolic, and then precisely with the Enlightenment and then modernization, it goes downhill from there. And just to unpack this and understand that it's not been this way always, I think is a very eye-opening thought for most citizens within the city. We started doing walks. We had 8 walks through the months of July and August. And artists came with us who would draw some of these. These are all on that webpage that I just shared. And starting at the beginning of the river, which is a very uneventful moment here where the Rio San Pedro and the Rio Macarao join. It's been completely subverted under the rails of the metro system, and not a celebrated moment of this poor river in any way. We walked the entire way and found some of these, actors of the river today that I mentioned earlier who mine the ground. And it's very compromised relationship in some points because of how the highway has been built on top of it, but also just amazing moments that already exist and were thought of. This pathway here along the edge was thought of and built as part of a kind of, coupling of the city with this piece of infrastructure. And as we kept on, visiting these segments of the river, everyone was amazed, surprised to discover not only the beauty of the landscape, but infrastructure that already exists, like these paths along the edges to be able to visit it. And people like Elisa Silva, who's the ex-director of the Botanical Garden, explained to us the wealth of vegetation that's already appearing along the edges. There are ramps that were built to serve the river all along its edge that you can access, and you can actually, pretty much touch the water. We met neighbors who use these, this is in La California Sur, paths on a daily basis to walk their dogs. And then moving further into the narrative, at the end, when it comes through the Barrio Petare, the relationship very the synergy is extremely intense, and children play in the river, and this imaginary of a river that you would use, that you would play in, although it really is disgusting to most everybody, is just the signaling of a desire that could be acknowledged. And once you leave Caracas and it's no longer channeled through concrete, it gains once again this sort of in nature, the rocks that have been cut over centuries and millennia because of the passage of this water. We are not particularly pushing a project forward. It's more the switch in people's minds with respect to this element that is obviously the beginning of the city. The city begins because there's a river. And so along with those walks, we have a lecture series that's actually going on right now. It started at 1 p.m. today with our second lecture. I invite you to join if you're curious about the rest of them. And we will also be working with schools. This is Roca Viva, which is in Petare, Fe y Alegría school right near the river. This incredible rock is also part of the history of the millennia that had been producing the river's course. So the idea here is with artists that have been working with us to create a game where the student, the children, the kids of the school will save the river essentially from all of these evils that have happened to it. And it'll have, different strategies and so forth. It's still in the making, but I want to highlight the importance of kids in imagining different possibilities in terms of social justice or environmental justice, and that we as designers have a lot that we can bring to the table through engaging children. And what better way than games, right? So the second story I want to tell is now in Mexico, and the point of entry here is the kind of discovery of mezcal and all the interest that has risen over the past 10, maybe a few more years around this spirit, which is produced in only certain areas of Mexico. So what is mezcal, and how does this kind of open a narrative on territories within Mexico that had previously been, not too terribly on the radar of anybody in particular? We're seeing an image here of Agua del Espino, which is in Oaxaca, just south of the city itself. And the territories that are often coupled with mezcal making are actually parts of ejidos, or common land. Much of Mexico is actually a common land, and it either started this way during the time of the First Nations or the indigenous populations prior to colonization, but also was part of the kind of scene after the Porfiriato, where increased rights were given to First Nations or indigenous populations. So it's a mix of the point of origin, but the fact remains that a lot of land in Mexico is actually of a communal sort of statutory standing. The second point that's interesting to understand is that there are 3 states in the southern part of Mexico that are considered most impoverished, Oaxaca being one of them. And Oaxaca is this state that's right down here, highlighted in black. And it is one of the DOC, that's denomination of origin is protected, that produces mezcal in Mexico. Mezcal is made from any type of agave plant, doesn't matter. Tequila is actually one of the forms of mezcal made from blue agave, but the interesting part of mezcal is that it can be made with any kind of agave plant and in combinations. So it actually has a lot to it of the wine culture of terroir and the process and what the land is like, where it came from, and the species that were in the seasons in which they grew. The pines are what is left after you take off the leaves. They're weighed, they're burned in earth ovens with wood, which is a key part of this whole equation. And once they're burned, they are kind of ground either through a mechanical process of this nature, or it could be with machinery. The effect has little incidence on the taste or on the quality of the mezcal. Then it's fermented, and after it's fermented, distilled. Interesting thing is that that fermented liquid was something Indians or the first populations in Mexico were producing prior to the Spaniards. And then the Spanish introduced distillation. So pulque, or beer kind of liquid, has now become a distilled spirit with that combination. It can either be in copper or earth clay alambiques, which is the container in which it's distilled. Wood, though, wood is an issue because of the deforestation that has caused in the region. It already is a dry area of Mexico, but it had been able to produce one complete cultivation cycle of mostly corn, beans, and squash. But with climate change and with these more recent changes because of the mezcal industry's kind of excitement, it becomes a worrisome factor for the community. And access to water is, through wells, becoming more and more of a issue as well, because we can tell that the level of the aquifers is decreasing. Academia is an amazing space to be able to begin to explore, but also understand these narratives. As I was speaking with students from Harvard Graduate School of Design in 2019, we visited and spoke with communities of this area, one of them Avila Mountain, and some of my students produced these answers to how to collect and keep water, how to re-humidify this surface. The first one here is through kind of water retention mechanisms that are not one large reservoir, but atomized and multiple within an it's sort of the strategy used to produce oases, actually. And the tendency of monoculture and monocultivating agaves for the mezcal production, it's actually a plant that used to be understood as a wild plant. It would grow in combination with any number of other pieces of vegetation. So to think of the plant as being coupled with a forest and much of the reforestation effort could really go hand in hand with the agave production for mezcal. This was a project by another student, Melody Stein, as a member of the Option Studio, and Kusina Cheng, who did something very similar, considering even agriculture mixed with agave and the reforestation process. So accelerating, we have, for the past 2 years, begun a reforestation process in Avila Mountain. This is the land as it appears in the dry season, which now lasts practically 7 or 8 months. And this is that very same view taken from almost the same perspective in a recent visit where we planted trees once again. The ritual starts with a Zapotec enactment that calls the rain, and with members of the community, we kind of start doing this offering, and seeds are also placed together with the flowers. And then we began planting. This is Herminio Coronado, who's my friend because he's also the mezcal maestro, one of them in Agua del Espino, and just an amazing individual. But others planting the donation of trees that we had received from the Harpelou Foundation. So women and men, and this is a bit of that territory that we're tackling to slowly reforest. One of the changes that has happened is that it needs to be fenced off to allow farmers who are taking their animals to graze to understand that this is a territory that's off limits. And the little plants, we planted pines and what they call tronadores in this time. And the water collection devices, also a very important strategy to rehumidify the surface and allow the water that's closest underneath to swell again. So understanding the territory is very, very challenging. I was showing walks that I did recently and then coupling them with photographs to understand, well, which are the critical areas that need to be tackled for reforestation? How's the agave planting actually threatening and making the surface less humid? Agaves need very, very little water. And so these are the challenges that we are facing right now, but a very, fantastic place to be, thanks to economic support that we finally were able to muster up from the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard. And these are just some of our maps trying to find which of those spaces could work best to locate the water catchment devices. And what we see here is coupling of proximity to roads in yellow, proximity to the natural water drainage path, which is in blue, and the red are all those areas that have an inclination towards the north where radiation will be less intense, right? I found on my walks some wells, water retention pools, very similar to the kinds of things that we hope to be bringing to the territory over the course of the next year and a half. And partnering with folks in the Oaxaca region like INSO and Juan Jose Consejo, who has done something very similar in a part that is west of Oaxaca City called El Pedregal. The other part of this story, so mezcal has allowed us to see something that was already critical to these communal lands, the depletion of their forests and fewer acts or a resource in terms of water that's been diminished. But the other side that this is also kind of another avenue of work that this has opened is what do you do with the waste products of mezcal? And the waste products of mezcal, which are this kind of hairy, fibrous material, is benign basically, and it can be used for many purposes in agriculture and otherwise. But this liquid here that you see is always poured onto the ground. It's called vinaza, and it's the byproduct of the distillation process. It's very acidic. Poured on the ground, it ends up entering the aquifers and acidifying the water as well. It's produced by tequila. It's produced by every rum that you consume. Most alcohols have a vinaza that's acidic and probably being disposed of in an illegal or not very ecologically friendly way at present. It's a kind of, I think of it as an environmental fiasco and a denouncement that needs to be made, the sooner the better. Interestingly, bricks made of earth, so Adobe Bricks, can be, and historically by some of the indigenous populations that made mezcal in the early days, were being used to create these Adobe Bricks. So you mix that fiber and you use instead of water, the vinaza, and you can make bricks that have shown very favorable conditions in terms of elasticity and strength at the same time. And this we discovered with a group called COA led by Alejandro Montes, and has also become a collaborator of this effort that we hope to start over the course of this year in Nahuel Espino. What you're seeing here are 1,000-liter vats full of that vinaza, and then a slightly more complex way of mixing it with cement mixers. And here's the process of how you actually just make a brick by brick in its mold. Most of the structures in Oaxaca and in the southern part of Oaxaca and Nahuel Espino were built of Adobe bricks. And this is something that has been lost due to the narrative of development and modernization, which says concrete is better, more hygienic, etc. It was also a big industry that grew after the war from Europe, and a big clientele was found in America, in Argentina and Brazil, Mexico, Cuba, Venezuela. And the story, the narrative is, this is better, this is progress. Even public policy today continues to reinforce these stigmas against earth construction, right? Even multilateral organizations have defined poverty in terms of materials that are considered natural materials. So the wording is actually, you are considered in a dimension of poverty if in your housing at least one of the 3 housing materials for roof, walls, or floors are inadequate. The floor is of natural materials and or the roof and walls are of natural or rudimentary materials. So here we go, building narratives that have actually done a great deal of damage ecologically. Cement companies flourished in Mexico, including Oaxaca, and propagated the cement, the cinder block, the use of concrete, always with this coupling of it being a more hygienic, a progressive material. Even small structures kind of in the landscape and then the farm are now found always in cinder block. But when you compare them, Adobe bricks and cinder blocks, of course, the embodied energy is far, far greater in concrete. That's the one we see right here. And in the percentages of a mechanized Adobe brick is 30% of that, but of an Adobe brick, like the COA ones built in place with, you know, materials from the site, so not even including transportation, is none at all. And the thermal properties of Adobe bricks for this kind of climate in Oaxaca and in southern Mexico is far greater, because during the day, as it receives radiation, it stays cool, and then at night it keeps the warmer air inside as temperatures drop crazy at night on the outside. And so the cinder block on the other side, on the other hand, is always hot when it's hot and is always cold when it's cold. And you'll talk to folks and they'll say, yes, I remember my parents' home was very comfortable both during the day and night. So this time with students from the University of Toronto, we endeavored to make Adobe bricks using Vinasse and bagasso. And here we see Herminio, my friend again. And that was, you know, an amazing experience. It is laborious, but the material is there. It's of the place. This is Herminio's palenque. He's producing Vinasse all the time, and the bagasso as well. So the students then produced ideas that we have shared with the folks from the town, mostly to destigmatize this material and to have them sort of dream of structures that are as complex as they desire. This is the case of a palenque where mezcal is made. And we're even exploring the possibilities of using this material for the to hold back the sides of the dug collection ponds as we build them over the course of the year. This was the work by Ted Marchant, who was one of my students in Toronto, and understanding how, together with carrizo, which is like a form of bamboo that would act in tension, these could ostensibly hold the earth. So we are in the midst of starting kind of a little COA company or collaborative in Agua del Espino, together with Alejandro Montes, and with the support, of course, of the local authorities, to actually force the mezcal makers not to throw their Vinasse onto the ground, but to collect it in this new factory that we're imagining that will produce the Adobe bricks. As I said, in comparison to cinder blocks, cinder blocks are, you know, ready, you buy them, you build, and in terms of time, considered to be, you know, pragmatic choice for construction for the neighbors of Agua del Espino. But the material itself is to produce it is much less expensive. And so the logistics, the costs of transportation, et cetera, has to be included, and probably makes sense for each of these to be produced locally for the immediate needs of construction or of landscape. And yeah, destigmatizing the material is by far the biggest challenge, and recovering kind of a view of it as something that's desirable, as something that does mean, an aspiration, a place to arrive, which is how concrete had been marketed to the locals. My last story, and this is kind of, I guess, the one that I've been working on the longest, has to do with the Barrio La Palomera in Caracas and the program Integration Process Caracas, which we also started with Ciudad Laboratorio in 2018. Started it, as usual, with a manifesto. And so this manifesto is, what does the barrio need? Does it need assistance? Does it need to be intervened? And we love this word intervention in architecture. And I think it sounds very aggressive to people. The barrio is not a sickness nor a disease. What then does the barrio need? It needs recognition from within and from outside as part of the city. To continue to think of the barrio as a disease or an illness, an urban illness, doesn't help us to understand it as an active part of the city, a place that can be used and of movement lived by all. And these are two artists you might find them on TV's sitcoms, Carlos Sanchez and Mariela Suarez, who were reading this in the Plaza Bolívar right next to La Palomera in Baruta. We then just invited folks with many excuses. These are what we call seduction strategies to bring people to get to know La Palomera. And Jose Perez, who writes décimas, these are kind of rhymes with music, has shared some of his own about La Palomera as everyone made a walk through the neighborhood. We also invited artists. This is a very synthetic version of all the work, but we invited artists to present projects, and this would allow us to connect with different demographic sections within the community. Harold Palacios and Maria Alejandra Orozco are students who have now their own initiative that's beautiful from the Fundación Migot. And they taught children from La Palomera in different schools how to dance the tambores of San Millán and other traditional dances. And then the kids from one school would teach the next. Adolescents and how they can become part of our initiatives is always challenging for their interests and their anxieties as well. But Wilfer Perez and Ambar Armas engaged them, taught them how to create engravings and views of both scenes within La Palomera and personalities. Gabriel Nas and Ambar Armas again visited all of the gardens, knocked on people's doors. Can we see your garden? And began to have a conversation with the owners about what these gardens were about. More kind of recognized folks in Caracas, Elisa Silva again from the Botanical Garden, and Enrique Blanco, who's a very well-respected landscape architect in Venezuela, came along and visited. We did a tour of all of the gardens, kind of recognizing them as something of merit and all the knowledge that goes into them. The Cross of May was something we celebrated and made into kind of a mobile museum, first with this model that was assembled in the Plaza Bolívar. People recognizing which is their home is a very powerful gesture of recognition. Again, that model was part of a procession that came through the barrio. And here we see a drawing that records that procession within the neighborhood, and then reassembled to begin a conversation inside the barrio on top about its history, about its relationship to, say, the city of Baruta, which dates all the way back to colonial times, and more recent neighborhoods like Piedra Azul. And I mean, La Palomera has been there since 1936. It's much older than a lot of the city itself, and this lingering need to continue to affirm its recognition as part of the city. The Cruz de Mayo is a traditional festivity that has music, of course, and dance associated with it that we kind of choreographed together with the folks from the neighborhood. And here, of course, a very animated party at the basketball courts at the end. The recognition of the story that produced this particular barrio and all barrios is something that's pending. We know very well the story of the modern architecture that builds Caracas, but this is the traditional, or the, let's say, the other architecture that builds the city. And I love to quote Nestor Garcia Canclini, an Argentinian philosopher who talked about the hybrid nature of Latin American culture. It is both modern and it is traditional. And this insistence of placing them as binary opposites has not done us any kind of merit. And that's part of this narrative. Like, the city is complete when all of its parts are considered, and those parts are not antagonistic to one another. They are hybrid. They are sort of grafted into one another. And here are the elders and their offspring telling the stories of how La Palomera started and grew over time. That work has allowed us to implement changes in the community. And one of them, which has to do with recognition, is that the services, such as waste collection, are very, very different from between the, let's say, quote, formal parts of the city and the informal ones. And this is the modus operandi. So everybody's supposed to bring their waste down because there are no, formal streets that come through the barrio. And therefore, every entrance, which is where the waste truck can come up against, is actually the welcoming moment of the barrio is a container full of waste. And this is systemic throughout the city. With lots of meetings and I'm condensing everything tremendously here, but it is now this lovely garden, terrace garden that the neighbors take care of. And because the service is now collected door to door, which is what I failed to explain here, it's door to door, just like any other part of the city. That waste goes directly into the truck, and there you don't need a middle point any longer, and it really does dignify and create a more fluid passage between the fabrics of the city. These are the folks of Fospuca who, together with the city of Baruta, have been our kind of allies in this project. And here we are meeting with them and understand hiccups in the system, how to address problems, how to address some of the lingering challenges. We've also been asked to produce other solutions in neighborhoods like Santa Cruz del Este, which is also in Baruta, much larger barrio that had an entrance the same as all the other barrios, with waste collected, not even inside the container provided. It's always for decades had something similar to this. And this is the mechanism for collecting that waste, which would have been like 50 times larger than what you see here. And so I've been after this project for a long time, and it was finally built and completed last month in September. It is now a very, very frequented little plaza. This is that same rock that we were seeing earlier. And now, because it's a much larger barrio, oh wait, I wanted to say something here. One of our friends from La Palomera, William Diaz, came to help the neighbors here plant these gardens. And to be able to produce these moments that, instead of heightening the difference between, let's say, the people who live in a building across the street and the barrio that's behind us on this image, this public space, in a much more dignified way of taking care of waste management, dilutes that difference. It makes it almost invisible. And why should there be a difference any longer? And these are sort of the kinds of operations that we're very keen to produce, because they change the narratives in the city. The space enclosed is to keep two containers that, while one goes, another one stays. But this is let's say, a short-term condition. We hope this will become soon a place for recycled materials to be collected, and that the waste management process itself will be more similar to that of La Palomera, with a reduced volume after recycling is separated. But that is to come. And the second kind of piece that it's enabled us to do, in addition to the waste management, is to begin to transform this space, which is right next to the city of Baruta and between La Palomera and Baruta, into a cultural center. It was going to be a high school. It had been a house abandoned for a number of years, and the neighbors themselves came to us and asked, well, what could we do here? And that's something that happens once you've produced this level of kind of trust and, you know, years of listening. So the gesture was just unbelievable, and we took up the challenge. The space started with just cleaning it up, getting all of that out, and making, and again, a party with cultural events and performances. And again, I'm summarizing this tremendously, but musicians from La Palomera and a big party. We are very much into parties. It's an amazing form of cohesion in the neighborhood. With COVID, it became challenging to connect with people, but we tried different strategies to call folks to share with us talents and initiatives that they already have. We discovered that Getsemani is a theatrical group in La Palomera that's been there for almost 15 years. This was the first piece that they presented in January of this year. The space itself had to be kind of intervened. We needed a bathroom, staircase that did not exist to connect the two levels, a roof on the second story that did not exist either. So funds that we've been able to put together from the Swiss Embassy, French Embassy, an entity in Germany called Across Design, and the Graham Foundation for the cultural activities has allowed us to start putting this together. And it's a process that's very different from those two projects that I shared at the beginning, because everyone's involved here. Every step is kind of an excuse to enact or rehearse what does a piece of the city and architecture that is really engaging everyone and is sort of democratically produced. And so with that financing that we had, the first three things were the staircase, the bathroom, and the roof, just to get this to be operative. The garden is all entirely William Diaz, one of the neighbors. We had a bamboo workshop to learn how to keep it from getting animals in it, and then use that bamboo to create the roof structure on the second story. So lots of people participating in that. And then as it's evolving over time, we are, instead of waiting for it to be entirely finished, beginning to activate it as we speak today. Right now, there's actually a book reading that's going on with little kids from the soup kitchen and the cofradia of the Diablos Danzantes, which is a traditional kind of celebration. We'll be rehearsing here. We have 2 musical groups, 2 theater groups, dance groups that are beginning to kind of populate this place with activity over the course of the next month before the Christmas holiday. We've also given it a water collection system, which is already in place, and that was workshops so that people could also understand and learn that they could collect water in their own home, because access to water as a service is also a big disparity within the city. Everybody actually has problems with access to water. And here's the ambassador of France kind of there to see the project, and together with the mayor of the city. This is a large endeavor, a cultural center for many, and we just hope that this continues to grow and be understood not as a place of La Palomera, but of the city, a place for exchanges, a place to get to know this other, a place to be seduced and come to the barrio because of the movies, theater productions, concerts that are being offered there. And of course, for education, this is Elvira just about to receive the folks from the waste collection group that we've been having workshops with them as well. So I love this quote from Stan Allen, which is really questioning our way of practicing architecture, how to engage all the complexity and indeterminacy of the city through the methodologies of a discipline so committed to control, separation, and unitary thinking. This is the dilemma of the architect working in the city today. Architecture and planning historically aligned with technical rationality and committed to the production of legible, functional relationships. have had tremendous difficulty thinking their roles apart from the exercise of control. And so this deschooling, in the words of Ivan Illich, which John Turner also was a big fan of, deschooling ourselves away from this kind of need to control all dimensions and allow for more participation and more engagement from people. It's absolutely necessary. Now, just to end, show you guys a few images from this piece of La Palomera that's in Venice. It's all of the public walkways, gardens, and public spaces that populate a certain one segment of La Palomera, 1 to 30 scale. Behind it, you see the ethnobotanical dictionary of the plants, 260 species that grow in La Palomera and have been recorded for how they grow, how if you can use them for medicinal purposes or for or culinary purposes. And these, intricate moments here are trying to reproduce for the audience something of, let's see if this starts. It's a video, but doesn't seem like it's getting started. That's okay. But you can see the images of like the plants are also the actual plants that grow in those spaces. This is the dictionary, and on the other side are drawings of each of the gardens of La Palomera and some of the public spaces. So bringing it back into drawing is a huge gesture of acknowledgement as well. These are designed spaces, not designed in our sense of understanding, but they have been thought through. There's a lot of intention behind them, and that's something that we were very keen to show. It's still going to be there for another 3 weeks. And all of that is accessible at lapalomera.org, which we created with codes to be able to go from the gardens in the model into more information through a website. And I invite you all to join, to see it. A little piece of that and the acknowledgement of those gardens in Caracas happened, this was in the month of August, where we presented a piece of the museum, again from Venice, back in Venezuela, using Marcel Duchamp's tool, the boîte en valise, which is a piece of a museum. That's how he used it, or a piece of a work that he was intent to communicate and share with somebody else. So this box has seeds, the newspaper of La Palomera, drawing, a postcard from the biennial, and then the lid is reversible with the portrait of the owner in their garden. We also presented posters of those drawings and all the species that we mentioned. And finally, this narrative, which is very much about acknowledgement in the case of the Venice Biennial in Chicago at the Available City. La Palomera is this vignette that you see in the center, but it has El Calvario and Colinas de Bellomonte to each side. These are 3 locations in Caracas that have had these kinds of activities. Seduction is sort of, I think, the message to bring you to a territory that you perhaps feel is distant, foreign, not part of the city. And so this gesture of integration, of completing the city, is not only, or should not be understood as something that has to do with form and architecture, but people. People connect, people go to them, and then through their memories have a way of making the city, amplifying their map of the city. So this is Caracas, this would be La Palomera, El Calvario, and Colinas de Bellomonte. And there are many other amazing initiatives that go on within a city that you just have to seek them out and find out, be curious. So we made a constellation that we then placed on the Chicago map, that you see over here, as a way to provoke people to say, well, what neighborhoods might you not know in Chicago, that because they randomly fall in those circles, you might decide to find out a little bit about them, or go visit them, or reach out to an organization that's there and get to know more of the city yourself. So the vignettes themselves are trying to reenact all of these activities. So some of them in La Palomera I've shown you. There's the garden. This is too fast, but just to see kind of the space that it was placed in. And then some of the celebration, the waste collection, the manifesto being read, murals being painted. These are sort of all of the tools of seduction that I was mentioning. Processions that go and might appear in one neighborhood will then be transferred into another neighborhood. And so the connections also made by the very actors themselves who, you know, create memories for folks. And then this one is in La Palomera, and you see that same procession now coming in to La Palomera. This is that garden that had been a waste place. And this is the annex in our future cultural center with the sancocho that's being, sancochos of Venezuelan stew. Projections on the walls were part of that one event called Nothing Out of the Ordinary. So this was our kind of way to try to communicate more of what goes on. And it's a drawing, but it's a moving drawing that gets projected onto a stage that is sort of like a little Teatro Olimpico in Vicenza. It's a compressed perspective through many layers. This is the lyrical angel that appears in several places, one of them in Colinas Bellomonte, from the balcony of a building. And then a dance performance that was also presented by some of the dancers that have been with us in La Palomera as well. They were in each of the levels of the building. So the arts, by generating pleasure and connection with acts of subversion and cultural reflection, produce an enduring and even attractive dialogue with the prejudices of the past, rather than one fraught with fear and defensiveness. And so my argument is to be able to mold these narratives, we have so much to learn from art, which is exceptional at doing this. We are a profession that has everything to do with space, and space is fraught with challenges that can be addressed, I think, more frontally if we understand all of the baggage that the narratives that are associated with them carry. And I just would like to end with that, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Elisa, for your presentation and for showing us some of your work. Right now, we're going to start the question and answer time. If you're on the Zoom call, you can ask your questions in the chat, or you can unmute and ask it through that. Or if you're watching it on the YouTube, you can ask it in the chat. I'll start off the question and answer time by asking you a question relating to the route that your office took. You know, it's a unique route just because it's not common that, you know, an office focuses on these community-oriented projects. A lot of the times, the projects, it seems that it's more related to you trying to make a connection between, you know, who you're designing for, rather than, you know, making these like large buildings that normally would be there. I wanted to ask why. Could you explain why you decided to prioritize these types of projects, and what went into the decision of deciding on that?
Thank you, Ramses, for your question. Yes, I think once I mean, I didn't have this clear at all at the beginning, and our practice is now going on 15 years. Those two projects that I did not talk about at the beginning were amazing lessons. The first one, Sabana Grande, was a top-down project commissioned by the cultural branch of the oil company in Caracas. It was won through a competition. I mean, all of the conventional ways that kind of we think of as architects starting an office, sort of I had that opportunity, won a competition, it was actually built. But it's an amazing public space. It's a huge public space in Caracas. And the way that the commercial entities were engaged and the way they were addressed, it just was, it made a lot of noise for me. They were told, they were informed, they weren't really asked. The idea was that if we would be able to do a pilot piece, they would see how wonderful the whole thing was going to turn out. And then the tension from all the rest of the segments and all the rest of the commercial entities along the way would dissipate because they were just going to be so impressed with the project itself. And this kind of faith that form alone convinces and gets people behind something. You know, I think it's a very problematic part of what the myth that we have in our heads about what architecture can achieve. I was too young. I was just starting out there. I definitely didn't have the power to propose something different. And so it just left the uncertainty of, well, you know, how could that be, or how should that be formulated? And then the other project, which was the church took 10 years to build because funds just came very, very slowly. And I, at a very, you know, like incipient moment in my professional career, came up with this, you know, complete design. The church is a complete church and would only really work until the roof was completely on the building. And so for 10 years, Mass was held without a roof, in the space, kind of enacting it. But what if it rained? I quickly understood at that point, not quickly, at the end of the 10 years, I understood that had I the chance of doing it again, I would have never produced a design that would not be operative from as, you know, early a moment as possible. And so the emphasis on the form, which is all that I kind of had in my head at that moment, and what I understood about community participation, which was mostly that the community participated in its construction because it's all local labor, is not enough. That is not enough. And how to operate in a city that is used by people, they're going to be the users from, you know, the first moment, and its success is going to entirely be dependent on them, needs to include them in the process. So this experiment that we have right now of producing a culture center in La Palomera from a ruin that's pre-existing and how to transform it is an opportunity to just sort of think about this. And it does produce some frustrations because the, you know, details aren't exactly how you would have imagined them or how we've been conditioned to imagine them through our, you know, formative years in architecture. But when I see the results and I see all the people that are excited to come use the space, and I think we're already going to run out of space. So I've talked to the mayor to let us use the house that's next door that's not being used at this moment either. Is super exciting. It's just and that long, it takes time. So I think understanding that projects and communities are something that are a long-term project. These 3 stories that I shared today are long-term projects, you know, and it's how I feel is a very beautiful kind of an honest way to go about work. So.
Thank you, Elisa. Thank you for the lecture. I have a question. Through your experience practicing and developing these very community-driven projects like in La Palomera, do you see these methods being applied in neighborhoods around the U.S. that have been painted in a negative way in the past, and in order to attempt to break the negative stigma that damaged the image of the people and communities in these areas?
Yeah, it's a great question, Fernando. I think, I mean, you know, this the divide between the developed world and the global South, and which is transferring knowledge to which part of the world, is something I think that is really worth shaking up a bit, because of the inequality that has been a part of Latin America, at least. And, you know, yes, I'd say most of the global South is plagued by a terrible inequality. The methods that have been developed to contest that and to deal with that, largely through art, sort of art associated with activism, I think are not only are they kind of a passive, an effective way of going forward, but passive in the sense that it's, you know, it's not, they're nonviolence, and I think those are lessons that, yes, I wouldn't say need to come here, because I think there are a lot of organizations out there in different cities of the US that are already operating in these terms and that are eager to magnify their voices. But perhaps what can happen is from academia, we can help magnify those voices. We can become partners with them and be a stage to allow them to become more and more mainstream and more accessible to the elite, which is ultimately those who I think are most needing of changing their minds and their hearts to, open what has been a view that is constrained through prejudices and so forth. That's why I love ending with that quote about art. Art is a beautiful way of opening people to maybe question some of these prejudices and biases. So yeah, I think those exist. I think they're already happening in the United States, and maybe we just need to go out there and be a loudspeaker to help make them more visible. Also, the strategy of being partners with folks, like not thinking that every project one has to, think of it on one's own, but to become an ally with others on things that you feel are significant is an amazing way, I think, to go about practice as well. Anybody else?
I have a comment that I would love to for you to explain further. I mean, it's always great to see your work. It's always great to see the passion and the commitment. And but a lot of this is not possible if we don't understand that part of the work that the architect has to do as part of the involvement is activism, and is understanding that as part of the design process and as part of the strategies, but also the thinking and the sort of the building of a philosophy that will make these projects kind of realized and to effectively happen, right? So together with going out to the community, I know, because I know the practice a little bit, there is involvement of people that dedicate their time, like volunteers, and people from the communities, but also people from the city, but also students. Can you kind of like, because we are here in FIU, and I mean, it's great to see Matthew and Fernando and Ramses sort of participating here, but there is also, I mean, there are all the other students that are listening and looking, and what is that model? I mean, you were showing all the Harvard GSD students in Oaxaca, kind of working, building blocks and stuff like that. And I know you're kind of walking the city with your seminar students all these weeks here in Miami. So can you describe a little bit of that process, or how that's been happening?
Yeah, no, thank you. Well, in the projects in Caracas, in La Palomera, I did studios at the Simón Bolívar University and in the Central University from the very beginning. And those were also, it's just terrible to have to summarize stuff in time, key to observing and getting to know and learning. I mean, there are people like, for example, Ana Vargas, who's now very much engaged in this kind of work, and she was my student in my very first studio in La Moran in 2009. People that have been my students like Sergio Dos Santos and Valentina Caradona from the Central University, they are now in Chile, but they're doing work in a way that is, and either through academia or through offices, that is still very like affected and conditioned by their practice as students and then within the office. And recently, I mean, the folks that are in the office now were in somewhere, they're my students at the Simón Bolívar University. But there's also something that's really beautiful called community volunteer work, which is stipulated by the university. And I opened several of these opportunities for students in the Simón Bolívar University. And so they came, and for example, Gabriela Alvarez, who's now working in the office, was a volunteer person in La Palomera, one of the very, very early projects in 2016. So I would say in Venezuela, the universities are very much engaged in these kinds of issues for sure, through projects, through visits, through, actual, conversations with people. And I think that's been a beautiful, shift, definitely in Simón Bolívar, which I know better. Studios are real. They are in the community. They meet with the folks and they present their work to the community. And they operate very much like the city is the laboratory. The city is what we work on.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Professor. I really liked your lecture. I really respect you. I'm from Bogota, Colombia, so I really live through those issues. And I really appreciate you involving art in what you do in our architecture, because we're all, as architects, we're artists, but like people don't recognize us at MASH. So I really like your lecture and I respect it a lot. So how do we deal with the sociological aspects, with this all this, all these problems, issues we have in especially these countries through art and architecture. So how would you say on these third world countries? So I know we get a lot of feedback from people. So what's the best way to help us, to help them, So we do like a lot of, you have to ask them, you have to get feedback from them. But what do you think that was what they need the most? I know architecture, we can give them spaces, but behind the spaces, there's like a lot of education we need to do, right? So in order for them to learn and to take care of the spaces and to deal with the spaces in a more proper way. So what do you think is what they need the most for them to actually develop and, try to overcome all of these issues of poverty, homelessness, drugs, these mind issues of war, they being raised and born in a country where it's full of war, conflict, and security, and all these things?
Okay, it's a complex question. I'm just going to wrap up the previous question real quick, and then I'll go on to yours, lady. I feel that to be able to practice and be in academia in the profession of architecture is an amazing opportunity to experiment, but to question and to observe. And as a professor with students, I'm always interested in going into spaces that neither of us really understand and know. We're all of us re-questioning, reevaluating what's given. And in that sense, the work of students is key. The work of students can be amazingly influential in opening views for others, even for your professors themselves. And to think of that as being so pertinent because of the urgency of some of these narratives that are happening in the city that are alienating some, that are calling them marginal, or even from an environmental standpoint, like, doing terrible harm to the environment. Those kind of urgent aspects don't have answers that we have neatly packaged. And they're so complex also because they have to do with people. There's so much space here to innovate, to understand, to unpack. Academia is an amazing place to do that. And students are, we need the minds of all these students to become active, to like light up and question and look for the inconsistencies in all of these narratives and tackle them. So I hope that's a better job, Henry, of answering your question. But I think there's like a call to students to please be alert and find these overlooked spots about cities that, they need you. We need alert students. So,
Thank you very much, Professor.
No, for your question, I think the only thing I would say that, yes, I celebrate the artists are amazing, because there's a quote also that I didn't include, but it comes from an essay from a book called Architecture and Participation. It says artists are sort of free of having an end. They don't have to produce something in a determined way. Their work is always exploratory and therefore open to taking the directions that it would naturally take, right? And so not being deterministic is a huge value and a virtue of the ways that artists approach their work, right? Because you can arrive at something much more authentic. You can write, maybe not authentic is the word, but relevant, because there's been this openness to explore, right? and you don't have to arrive at something. You're not making an analysis to prove something a priori. It connects with people at different levels, despite socioeconomic or education, ostensibly. So extremely democratic in that sense. But I think what also I would highlight is that because of that openness of the artist's approach, you don't see yourself as doing beneficial or philanthropic work. It's not about doing good things for other people. It's not about having good intentions. And it's definitely not about thinking of yourself as a sort of a person that's coming to do good. I think these are premises that we've sort of also inherited from modernity that are problematic. We are trying to be allies. We are listeners. We want to facilitate. We want to be, friends. We want to create affection too. Like, I love that aspect of the work. You create, through love and through friendships, you create affection with the folks that you're working with. And that opens a path for practice that is completely different and is non-hierarchical and is not about going and intervening, like that word in the manifesto. It's not about going and, helping people or addressing their worst kind of the ills that afflict them. I feel that somehow will happen, but it needs to happen with a mindset of it as an equal, a horizontal kind of platform. So.
Thank you so much.
I have a question as well, and that is that your projects, not just the ones that you presented today, but some of the others that you can find on your websites and whatnot, they're in different areas, different spaces, but at their core, they all focus on inequalities within the built spaces, and they pretty much always serve underserved and underdeveloped communities. So I'm aware that some of them you get from winning a competition, but in other instances, how do you choose a specific community to work with? Is there a process that goes into picking a community, like what factors? And then once you get started, like what are some of the first steps that go into the work in these areas?
Okay. Well, I'm going to switch things around a bit. I'm going to ask if maybe Fernando and Ramses, given what we've done so far this semester, like how would you say, how do you go about getting to know a community and how do you get started with making a relationship with them?
I think just going there and just talking to people, I found very enlightening almost every time we go to a neighborhood around Miami that, you hear about, but you don't really experience until you actually, go around the streets. This past Saturday, we went to Little Haiti with an elder over there, and there's just so much rich culture there that, like, Little Haiti has this like very negative stigma of being a very dangerous area in Miami. But you go there and you just see like people playing dominoes on their front porch, playing music, salsa, typical Haitian music, and on the next corner there's like a food drive. There's so much people outside, interacting with each other. It's such a nice thing that, like, if you don't go there, you don't think that thing is like that, because you're going based off like the negative reviews and misinterpretations of the community. So it's been very helpful and very cool to just go around Miami this past semester and experiencing like a different type of experience of these neighborhoods.
Yeah, and just to add to that, it's I guess the goal when analyzing or trying to research a certain type of community is to try to get the insider perspective. We just had a kind of like a talk last I think it was yesterday with Nadesh Green. She's an NPR reporter, and she reported on some things relating to Little Haiti, and she just we presented our work and our research to her, and she mentioned that she was trying to emphasize the importance of really understanding how people that live there actually feel about their home, and trying to get that trying to understand the things that would only be known to someone that actually lives there. So again, that means like talking to people, communication. I think is like the biggest thing when it comes to like learning about that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
I have another question. So like, local government is very important to developing and funding of community projects. And through each one of your projects, how have you seen local government react? Have you seen more support with time, or have you seen more opposition?
Okay, well, I guess I'll say something brief about the case of Baruta and about the case of the Agencia Vago del Espino in Mexico. And the context is super different in both. So there's a lot going on in a city like Caracas. Some municipalities are of the opposition, some municipalities are held by the official government, and the way that they receive funds is very different. The way they operate is very different. So the municipality where La Palomera is located has been very weakened, very, very weakened over the years in terms of resources, in terms of personnel. The building that it once, built to have, I don't know, over 100 officers probably only has around 16 or 20 now. So there isn't much support that they can give other than the huge benefits that we have now of having a document that gives us the right to use that space for a number of years, and their complete buy-in into the project. The waste management project has their support. They don't fund it, they can't, they don't have it, but through this third operating entity called Pupuca, that people pay for the services, we have, we had the point of entry because the mayor, made that meeting be possible. Now, how did I develop a good relationship with the city and the mayor? That's a good question and a hard one. A lot of insistence, just trying to find people to connect, going once and again with small discrete projects that I was trying to get him to help us with. Him, because it's a he mayor. And yeah, so at the beginning, not too much enthusiasm. Some years have passed now, and he came to the event that we had recently to inaugurate the water collection system, and he listened. And somebody that was skeptical, absolutely skeptical of rainwater collection as a way to mitigate the issues of access to water, left with a changed perspective on it, which was wonderful to see. And a lot of enthusiasm to support in whatever capacity they can the work we're doing forward. And our hope is that, if we were to have something like the Sabana Grande project again, a large public space opportunity, that we, together with Ciudad Laboratorio, could be a part of orchestrating how that process could take place. Maybe, affecting processes within for convening folks, talking to them, having them listen to, so that what is made is actually a place to locate what folks already want and need. Often projects don't have that dimension. So slowly, I know Cheo, who's our partner at Ciudad Laboratorio, was just asked by the mayor for a meeting this week. We'll see what he wanted to listen to or what he wanted to say, but that's been an exciting evolution, just from seeing, products and always inviting him to come look at what we do. Then in the case of Mexico, it's a very different scenario because this is an agencia within a municipality. So they're not even the main entity. They're like the second entity beneath the municipality. And it's run through something called usos y costumbres. So they're not elected by political affiliation or anything like that. The ejidatarios, which means like these are the owners of this communal land and they've inherited it over centuries. Well, 1 century, they rotate in a way who is at the head. So in the case of the city itself, the little township, that's 1 year rotations. And in the case of the municipal land that's kind of around it, the common land around it, that is a comisario that's rotated every few years. So I've already met several over the course of time. And that year period makes it a little bit of a challenge. I think the fact that they met me as a professor, you know, I was just there with students. I was not going to evangelize anybody, and I wasn't a, you know, part of a political party, allowed for a certain openness from their part as well. And just the repetition, the insistence, the going back and listening to their things and kind of trying to come up with strategies so that what's being done isn't a foreign thing. What happens is very much in the spirit of what they are, you know, requesting. So their openness becomes very easy for them because, you know, it's all flowing, it's all going in the same direction. So those have worked out well. And I could, I guess, give you examples that have not worked out well. That would probably be equally important.
Thank you so much for that answer. So if there aren't any other questions, I think maybe we can wrap it up here. Thank you so much for taking your time out and giving us that really nice lecture. Thank you everyone for joining on our last lecture of the fall 2021 series. And everyone, please have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.